Hello and welcome. I'm Emily Molden, Executive Director of the Nantucket Land Council. Thank you so much for joining us for this special spring program, Planting for Pollinators on Nantucket. The Nantucket Land Council is an environmental nonprofit with a mission to protect and preserve our island's natural resources. In addition to a large focus on the quality of our island's waters, the Land Council, with the help of our members, has also worked to protect the island's unique habitats. In addition to maintaining the special historic character of the island, by protecting and preserving our native plant species, we support a large number of rare and endangered species and also help to maintain a healthy island ecosystem. Today, we're going to be focusing on one very important component of this ecosystem, our pollinators. Pollinators are important for many reasons, and unfortunately, we have been seeing huge declines in their numbers, particularly in native pollinator species across the country as well as on a global scale. This year, the Nantucket Land Council invites you to join us and our community to support these critical critters by creating pollinator habitat in your own backyard. I'm very excited to announce the launch of the Land Council's Planting for Pollinators on Nantucket program. Registration for this program is now open and live on our website, where you can find a link to submit your email address and some information, and we'll provide you with a brand new Planting for Pollinators on Nantucket guidebook that will contain all of the information and instructions that you need to create a small, medium, or large pollinator garden on your property. By creating this habitat and establishing such a garden, you will be providing a number of benefits to the local environment. In addition to supporting pollinators, you'll be supporting our native plant communities. And because these habitats and these gardens typically require very little water or fertilizer or chemicals, you'll also be helping to support the health of our water and general ecosystem. So please take a look on our website and join us in creating a network of pollinator habitat across Nantucket. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's program. Emily May is the Pollinator Conservation Specialist for the Xerces Society of Invertebrate Conservation. Emily is originally from Maryland, but after spending time studying wild bee communities in high bush blueberries, she received her Master's of Science degree in entomology. She's been with the Xerces Society since 2015, and I personally am a huge fan of the work that the Xerces Society does. So I couldn't be happier to be collaborating with them on this educational program for all of you. So please join me in welcoming Emily May.
Thanks so much, Emily. I'm really excited to be here. As you said, I'm a pollinator conservation specialist with the pesticide program for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. I'm really excited to talk to you today about a little bit about bee ecology and how that can inform how we plant for pollinators and manage our gardens for pollinators on Nantucket and elsewhere in New England. So with that, I will get started. So next slide, please. So the Xerces Society, if you're not familiar with us, we've been around since 1971, working to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. We have several different kinds of programs focused on endangered species, focused on aquatic invertebrates, but our biggest program is on pollinator conservation and agricultural biodiversity. Our name, the Xerces Society, were named for the Xerces blue butterfly, which is believed to be the first American butterfly to go extinct due to human development. It lived in the coastal sand dunes around San Francisco, and that's what you see here on the screen. So we do a variety of on-the-ground conservation work. And next slide, please. We have our main office is in Portland, Oregon, but we have field staff around the country working on pollinator habitat restoration, conservation planning, and technical assistance in agricultural spaces as well as urban spaces. So our field staff, which is in a bunch of different states around the country, some of those positions joint with the US Department of Agriculture Natural Resource Conservation Service. Our staff has supported the creation of over 1 million acres of new pollinator habitat since the 2008 Farm Bill. Next slide. So I'll just start with the real basics, which is probably a review for most of you watching, but pollinators are incredibly important to our natural systems as well as our agricultural systems. Next slide. We have, so pollination is the transfer of pollen or male gametes from the male part of the plant to the female part of a plant to set seeds, nuts, and fruits. So because plants can't move, they're reliant on animals or wind to transfer pollen between flowers. Pollinators are super important for natural systems. They allow wild flowering plants to reproduce and continue to reseed in their environments. And the seeds and fruits that those flowering plants produce are also food sources for all different kinds of wildlife, from birds to mammals. So through that simple act of moving pollen from flower to flower, pollinators are helping to build out the base of the food chain for many different species. And in some cases, they're also part of that base of the food chain themselves. About 9 in 10 bird species eat insects at some point in their lives, and caterpillars are a really important protein source for birds. Pound for pound, insects actually contain more than twice as much protein as beef. Next slide, please. Pollinators are also important for our diets. So pollination is essential to a substantial portion of the food that we consume. There's lots of estimates out there, but one of the better ones is that about 35% of global crop production worldwide either depends on or benefits significantly from insect pollination, which provides a lot of value economically around the globe. Also, the most important or nutritious parts of our diets are fruits and vegetables. The things that have vitamins and minerals and put color on our plates come from these insect-pollinated plants. Next slide. So this is a photo from a small project that we did a few years back with Whole Foods. And this is a typical produce section and what that looks like with all the different pollinated foods that we enjoy. Next slide. And this is what it would look like without pollinators or without pollinated crops. So over half of the items in this produce section were taken off the shelves. And it looks a little sad without all of that amazing food that is provided to us from pollinated crops. Next slide. On a personal level, pollinators are really important to my diet. Coffee and chocolate both are critical parts of my day-to-day life. And sort of a fun fact, chocolate is unusual in that it's actually pollinated by a fly. So many things are pollinated by bees primarily, but chocolate is one that is primarily pollinated by this tiny little midge, which can actually fit into the little tiny spaces in the cacao flower, which is a really intricate little flower with nectaries that are hard to access for larger insects like bees. So I always like to take a moment to give thanks to the cacao midge and all of the Cadbury Easter eggs and delicious treats that it brings to our lives. All right, so let's talk a little bit about who's responsible for pollination. Keep going. There's lots of different animals that visit flowers, usually for the sugary nectar that flowers provide, and that end up pollinating those plants. So butterflies and moths, flies, beetles. There are some vertebrate pollinators like hummingbirds, and at least in the Southwest US, there's bats that pollinate as well. Next slide. But our VIPs are very important pollinators, our bees. They're just very efficient pollinators. They're actively going out to collect and transport pollen back to their nests and feed their offspring. They are also particularly efficient because they have what's called this behavior called flower constancy, which is once an individual bee has figured out how to handle a flower and really efficiently collect pollen from that flower, they typically will go back and forage from the same kind of flower instead of going to and learning a new kind of flower, which is good for transfer of pollen and fertilization of that species. They are also typically foraging in an area just around the nest that they've built. So unlike migratory pollinators, they build a nest and they stay there and they're just foraging sort of in the area around where they've built that nest. So if you have nesting habitat for bees in your garden, they're really foraging on the plants that are present most easily accessible to them around that nest habitat. All right, let's keep going here. I did want to quickly just talk about honeybees, which are probably the first bee that pops into people's heads when bees come into a conversation. The European honeybee was brought to America by ship with European colonists. It's a single species. It's pretty unique. It's very different from many of our native wild bees that are just a single female with a very small set of offspring that she is collecting pollen and nectar for. They live in these big colonies with a single queen, but can be up to 10 to 20,000 workers in that colony. So very different just in scale from some of our solitary native bees. Their colonies are also perennial. So hopefully, if they make it through the winter, a queen would live for 3 or 4 years before there's sort of turnover in that colony. Whereas most of our wild bees, I can't think of others that are perennial. Our wild bees are annual species by and large. All of these features mean that the honeybee can be managed for crop pollination and can be mobile. So we have, thousands of years of a domesticated relationship with this species. And so they're quite different in a lot of ways from our native bees here. Next slide. We have a great diversity of wild native bees that we're looking to conserve in our environment here in Massachusetts. So there's over 300 species of wild bees in Massachusetts and more than 10 times that number across the rest of the country. These range in size from big carpenter bees that get into your sheds to really tiny bees about the size of a freckle. And a lot of them don't look like what you might think of when you think of a bee. So I'll go through some of the different kinds of bees and what you might be seeing in your garden that maybe before you would have thought of as a wasp, but might actually be a metallic green sweat bee. So why do we want to conserve wild pollinators? I mean, I think as a conservationist, there's just sort of inherent value in protecting species, but there also is some economic value as well. So our wild bees are really important pollinators of many of the crops that produce the food that we eat. So there was a big study recently that looked at a fruit set of different crops, 41 different crops, fruits, nuts, and vegetables. And it found that wild pollinators improved fruit set of those crops at twice the rate of honeybees. And that's for lots of different reasons. Some of them are just really efficient pollinators and really, really good at collecting pollen from, let's say, apples or blueberries. So the more diversity that you have in your pollinator community, the better and more of different fruits, nuts, and vegetables you would be getting in your gardens or on your farms. So there's more than one reason to conserve wild pollinators. Most of the more than 3,600 species of native bees in the US are quite different from honeybees, like I said. So in this first part of the talk, I'm going to go through some of the biology of these species, which is helpful as you sort of start to build on that and plan out how to support bees in your yards and gardens. So looking at native bees, our native bees can be divided into 3 kind of broad categories based on how and where they build their nests. The vast majority, about 2/3 of our wild bees, live below ground with only really tiny kind of inconspicuous holes that give any sign that they're there. Some of them look like little ant nests or just like a hole the size of a dime behind a bush in your garden. The other third live above ground in tunnels, in old snags and in pithy plant stems. And then a very small fraction, maybe 1%, the bumblebee species, form small social colonies in hollowed out cavities, which could be above ground in a tree or below ground. They're commonly nesting in old rodent holes where they can use kind of the old fur to provide some warmth as they build out their colony. Next slide. So we'll talk about bumblebees first. They're the most similar to honeybees in that they form these social colonies with a queen who lays, offspring that then help her out in the nest. But they're on a much smaller scale than honeybees. They only have, depending on the species, anywhere from 25 to 400 workers. And like I said, they're often nesting in abandoned rodent burrows or under sort of bunch grasses. These bees are just excellent pollinators. They are huge, they are hairy, and in terms of their behavior, they have the ability to buzz pollinate. So this is a behavior that bumblebees and some other categories of wild bees have that honeybees don't have, which is basically that they can use their wing muscles, their flight muscles, and they can vibrate them at a really high frequency. Like imagine a tuning fork vibrating really, really fast. And it just causes in some of the flowers that hold their pollen up in their anthers, just shakes out that pollen like a salt shaker. So something like a blueberry, which is what I studied for my master's, it's much more efficiently pollinated by any kind of wild bee species like a bumblebee that can buzz pollinate and vibrate out that pollen. So let's talk about, just real quick, the life cycle of a bumblebee colony, and we'll sort of contrast a social colony with the solitary lifestyle of most of our other wild bees. So the life cycle of a bumblebee colony, right around this time of year, you've had overwintering queens, so individual big fat queens that built up their reserves in the fall, have overwintered, and now they're coming out and starting nests. So pretty soon, as the weather warms up, we'll start to see big fat queens out, starting to collect pollen and nectar and lay eggs. And during this time of year, they're really acting like a solitary bee. So she starts her initial brood. She's going out collecting pollen and nectar from early spring trees and shrubs. And then once those hatch out, they'll take over the foraging duties in the summer. So her offspring, her daughters, will go out and start collecting pollen and nectar through the summer, while her main responsibility is laying eggs. Through that summer, the colony builds up, more daughters produced, and then in late summer, early fall, she'll produce males and new queens, which then leave the nest to mate. And those mated queens will start the cycle over, seeking overwintering sites and forming their own colonies the next year. Next slide. So just to contrast that to a solitary bee, these have a much simpler lifestyle in that it's just a single female going out, collecting pollen and nectar, bringing it back, and then her offspring will develop all the way through the season and emerge the next year. So there's not a shared responsibilities like there are with a social colony. So this is a mining bee, an Andrera. And this is what it looks like as she digs down underground. She'll start to build out a nest cell, provision a pollen and nectar ball, lay an egg on top of that, which then it hatches into a larvae. The larvae eats the pollen and nectar, develops into a pupa, and then overwinters and emerges as an adult the following year. For these ground nesting solitary bees, which is again, over 2/3 of our native bees are nesting underground. Most of them are solitary. Some nest communally, which is kind of like having an apartment building underground where they're sharing a nest entrance, but then have different sections below ground that they've built out. It kind of helps with kind of guarding and defense of the nest entrance to just share a single one. And some of the species, are nesting 5 centimeters under the soil surface, and then others are going almost a meter down. Some of the ones that go farther down are lining those nest chambers with waxy secretions that help them protect their larvae from moisture and fungi that would be potentially attacking them at that depth. So let's talk through some of these ground nesting bee species, so I'm going to go by sort of genus, but really what I want to do here, this isn't going to be a comprehensive ID, it's just going to be, what am I seeing when I'm looking at my garden at different times of the year? What's coming to the plants that I've put out there for pollinators? And if you're interested in kind of getting into more detail on identification, I would highly recommend The Bees of Your Backyard. It's a book by Joseph Wilson and Olivia Messenger Carroll, has beautiful photographs of all of these different kinds of bees. So let's start with our mining bees or digger bees. These are some of the first bees that come out in the spring after bumblebees, and they're sort of a small to medium size, so smaller than a honeybee, and they often have a dark abdomen and sort of a lighter thorax. Many of these species are specialists. So you have a willow bee that just feeds on willow pollen. You have blueberry bees that just feed on blueberry pollen. And this is one of the most diverse group of ground nesting bees. The next is sort of a similar group. This is the cellophane bees or Hallitus that also come out in early spring. They're called cellophane bees because they line their cells underground with these waterproof secretions that kind of look like cellophane. They might be easily mistaken for a honeybee. They're about the same size, and they have kind of a pale banding. Some of them have a pale banding on their abdomen. So you could look at this bee and go, oh, I saw a honeybee, but you might actually be looking at a cellophane bee. And again, like the mining bees, some of these species are pollen specialists. Going into the summer, some of the most common bees that you'll see in the summer are sweat bees, which might easily be mistaken for little black wasps. So you really have to kind of look closely and see, are they carrying pollen? If they have pollen on their bodies, they're probably not a wasp. Most wasps don't have a lot of obvious pollen on their bodies. These bees are super interesting, and we're constantly learning more about them. Some of them are solitary, and then some of them have really interesting kind of social, semi-social lifestyles where some, there's multiple generations in a year, and some of the daughters are helping care for the young. Many of these bees are generalists. So instead of just collecting, one kind of pollen, they're visiting all kinds of different flowers. So we'll be supported by all different kinds of flowers in your garden. And a cute little subset of sweat bees are green sweat bees, which are just some of my favorite, most beautiful bees. They are metallic green color. Like other sweat bees, they tend to be generalists. They also prefer a lot of times flowers where the pollen and nectar is more easily accessible for a small bee. So something like, the open flower here of the echinacea or coreopsis or something like that. Most of them are living underground, but there is a species that also nests in rotting wood. So if you have, standing wood, dead snags and logs on your property, you can always leave them because a lot of times there will be bees that come nest in them as well. Next slide, please. Going into later summer, when your sunflower species start coming out, you might start seeing these longhorned bees or hairy-legged bees, which is Melissades and Euceral. The reason they're called longhorned bees is pretty obvious. The male has very long antennae or long horns. The females have these really hairy legs, which is where they carry their pollen. And they're very robust bodied. So kind of like a honeybee, but broader in terms of size. And some of these bees are aster family pollen specialists, so sunflower type species. So actually this has been updated in terms of its species name. Squash bee is now categorized with some of the other longhorned bees under Euceral, but this is a specialist bee that comes out in midsummer and specializes on cucurbits, so your melons and your squash. So if you have melons or squash in your garden, then, and you come out in the morning and you see, oh, there's some dark bees just hanging out in my squash flowers. It's probably male squash bees that have slept in the flower overnight and wait for those first females to start visiting in the morning. That's how they guarantee success for their mating strategy. So the males will dart around right around dawn, waiting for that female to come into the flower. All right, so that was some of your ground nesting bees. And then you have your tunnel nesting or above ground nesting solitary bees. So that's the other 30% roughly of native bees and where they nest. So these bees are basically going into old snags, going into pithy stems of different kinds of plants, and building out a nest sort of partition by partition. So what that means is they'll sort of, they'll go in, hit the back of a node in a pithy plant stem and start their nest with a pollen ball, lay an egg on top of that, and then build some other kind of partition, whether it's from sawdust or from mud or from leaf pieces, and then build another cell for their next offspring. So and kind of go bit by bit until they've filled up their tunnel. And I think I have a better picture of that on the next slide. So this is an example of a mason bee tunnel. So this is a cross section looking from left to right. That's going from the back of the nest to the front. And so the mason bee goes out, collects mud, builds a cell, fills it with pollen and nectar balls, lays an egg on top of it, and then keeps going, building cell upon cell upon cell until the tunnel is full. And then its offspring develop into little cocoons in there that overwinter in the cocoons, and then the adults emerge the following spring. So one of the cool things about these species, and this is just really cool biology, bees have the ability to choose whether they're laying a male or a female. It's called haplodiploidy. So they will lay females towards the back of the nest where they're more protected from predators, because they're really what's going to continue on the family line the next year. They need a lot more reproductive input. And then the males will get laid at the front of the nest, come out first, and then be waiting for females to emerge a little bit later in the spring. Next slide. Okay, so yeah, this is what those adults look like. This is a mason bee up in the top left. It has kind of a little bit of a metallic blue or green sheen to it. They again are about the size of a honeybee, if you can use that as a reference. And they have these big wide bodies and heads, which is part and parcel of nesting in wood or in pithy stems. They have these big mandibles for kind of chewing out some of that pith. They carry their pollen on the undersides of their abdomen as females. So they make really great pollinators of things like apples and cherries that have these open flowers. And they'll just come in and dive bomb the flower and rub around on their abdomen. So they're really efficient pollinators of those trees in the rose family that have that open pollen. Similarly related to the mason bees are leafcutter bees, which, as their name suggests, they cut leaves to make the different partitions in their nest. They're a sort of a variety of sizes, and they again have those really wide bodies and heads because they have such big mandibles for cutting leaves and going into tunnels. So they again have the scopi, which are the pollen collecting hairs on the underside of their abdomen. So they will also kind of belly flop onto flowers to collect pollen. So if you have, these beautiful round cuts in your garden, you might be seeing actually leafcutter bees in action. They love roses, they love red buds. I think this is a honeysuckle that they've cut from. So you'll start to notice this if you pay attention in your garden. You might have some leafcutter bee activity. One last thing I wanted to note about these bees is there is some movement towards managing these as alternative pollinators to honeybees in crop pollination, both mason bees and leafcutter bees. This is also where you'll see bee hotels, advertised as nesting resources for pollinators. I would say there's probably good ways to do this, and then there's ways that create pathogen buildup. So some of these photos here don't show great sanitation practices for having managed tunnel nesting bees. I would much prefer to see smaller, more spaced out living arrangements so that you're not creating some of the same problems that exist for honeybees when you bring all of these bees together and create a place that pathogens can kind of build up over time. So keep them spaced out if you are going to be putting any nesting resources for above ground nesting bees in your garden. All right, and then I think I have just a couple more slides for types of bees, and then we'll keep going. But this one is one you might recognize from your sheds or from other places where it's the Carpenter bee. It's the large size. This is one of the biggest bees out there, and it's also one of the largest of all insect eggs. So the egg that a female carpenter produces is actually, it takes up half of the mom's body size. So it takes a ton of reproductive output from her, a ton of energy, a ton of pollen and nectar collection for each egg that she's laying. And they're usually excavating their nest in wood. They look like bumblebees, but they have a shiny black abdomen. So where bumblebees would have a fuzzy abdomen, they have a smooth and shiny abdomen. The species that we have in Massachusetts, the eastern carpenter bee, has the female has a black face and the male has a yellow face. So you can always tell the male from the female if you can see it in the face. And the males don't have stingers. So sometimes the ones that are buzzing around, being very territorial, scary, don't have stingers and cannot harm you. It's good to know. And then we have small carpenter bees, which are much less conspicuous, much less noticeable. They're very small, like sort of wasp-like, and they often nest in these pithy stems. I have them in my bee balm actually, and echinacea, my purple coneflower stems, but they'll also nest in box elder and elderberry and raspberry canes, lots of other plants you probably have around the garden. They have multiple generations a year and they're active all season. All right, and then the last one that I wanted to mention is really cool from an entomology standpoint. These are cuckoo bees, which are nest parasites. They're not cool if you are the host species for them. Basically, what these bees do is that they take over the nest of their host species and feed on the. They will lay basically their eggs on top of the provisions that were provided by a different female bee that went out and collected all that pollen and nectar. So many of them look more like wasps than they do bees. They don't have a need for all the pollen collecting structures that other bees do, because what they're mainly doing is taking over other bees' nests. But one of the things to know about these is that they're actually some of the most threatened bees, because they're so dependent on their host, their specific host, that if the host is showing signs of decline, these bees will probably be in decline first. So we have a lot more to learn about these bees. There's a lot of diversity and they're not very well studied, but I think they're actually really cool. All right, so that was sort of an intro of what you might see as you plant out habitat for pollinators in your garden. I hope that was a nice little intro. I would, again, recommend The Bees of Your Backyard as a book if you're interested in sort of more field ID or looking at pretty pictures of different kinds of bees. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the threats that insects are facing and how what we're doing in our yards and gardens is part of the solution for some of the challenges that pollinators are facing. So there's evidence of decline in both diversity and abundance of a lot of different kinds of flying insects, including managed and wild pollinators, from a lot of long-term monitoring studies. we don't always have the monitoring data to say this particular species is in decline, or that particular species is in decline. But there's a good amount of sort of broad evidence suggesting that on the whole, we're seeing declines in abundance of our pollinating species due to a lot of the same stress factors that threaten all kinds of other wildlife. So some of those key threats include habitat loss. So we're seeing millions of acres of grasslands converted to crop in the Great Plains in the Midwest. We're also seeing that sort of urbanization and development happening in all kinds of different urban and natural areas. We also have other threats, including pesticide use, diseases and pathogens, competition from non-native species, and then climate change. So a whole bunch of interacting stressors that are leading to these sort of patterns of widespread declines that we're seeing. One thing I also wanted to mention is you hear a lot about honeybees, and honeybees are actually how I first got into pollinators back in college when colony collapse disorder sort of hit the headlines. That's when I first wanted to save the bees. And then as I got more into it, I realized, oh, honeybee has some unique challenges, but it's not on the verge of extinction. So the honeybee, Apis mellifera, it has some really challenging parasites, pathogens, diseases. It's moved around the country for crop pollination in ways that, as we probably have learned this year through a pandemic, might not be great, or they're very conducive for sort of the transmission of disease when you bring almost all of the managed pollinators to the same place for 2 weeks every year, which is California almonds. That's really challenging from a disease management perspective. But because it is a bee that is managed and one that we can intervene in, it's not a species that's on the verge of extinction. It will continue on. The bees that we are sort of most concerned about are the ones that we can't actually manage. It's our wild bees all around us that are challenged by some of the same stressors, but that we don't have the ability to directly manage in the way that honeybees are. So we know very little about the status of many native bee species. Next slide. Some of the groups that we have more long-term monitoring data on are bumblebee species. So there's 57 bumblebee species in North America. Next slide. And of those, more than a quarter are in a threatened category by the IUCN. So the IUCN surveys different species and sort of assesses their concern and the threat level that they're facing. And a lot of bumblebees are in some kind of vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered state, including several of our North American bumblebees. In Massachusetts, and I'm sorry that some of the formatting is a little funny on these slides, but in Massachusetts, there's a couple species of great conservation need and interest, including the rusty-patched bumblebee, Bombus affinis, which is a species of bumblebee native to eastern North America that has this small rust-colored patch. This is the left-hand picture, small rust-colored patch on the middle of their second abdominal segment. And this bee was really common throughout the east and upper Midwest of the US, but has declined somewhere around 90% from its historic range in the past 20 years. So the Xerces Society and others filed a petition almost a decade ago to list the rusty-patched bumblebee as an endangered species. The US Fish and Wildlife Service finally finalized that ruling in 2017. So it is our endangered bumblebee species. And actually, Cape Cod was one of the last places that the rusty-patched bumblebee was seen in Massachusetts. So this is a species that's been probably extirpated from a lot of its historic range, probably because of introduced pathogens from managed bumblebees. But it's one that I'm going to talk a little bit about Bumblebee Watch later in our conservation science efforts on this, where you can get involved with your smartphone. But this is a species that if you saw it, we would be so interested to know if it still has some extant populations in Massachusetts. And we think that if there's anywhere in Massachusetts that it's still present, it could be the Cape Cod and the islands area. which is where it was last seen in Massachusetts. The other species of conservation interest in Massachusetts is the yellow-banded bumblebee, Bombus turricola, which is another one that was common east of the Rockies and into southern Canada, but hasn't been seen in most of its range for about 25 years. But it may still be present in Massachusetts, Vermont, Maine, in especially higher elevations. So I wouldn't be, I don't think it's as likely to be out on Nantucket, but if you're out in the Berkshires, you might be able to see it. So these are two that we'd really like to keep an eye on. Okay, so there's also butterflies in decline, and more than about 1 in 5 North American butterflies are estimated to be at risk of extinction, including both butterflies that are habitat specialists, as well as formerly common and widespread species like this grass skipper. One of the ones I'm sure you're the most familiar with is the monarch. So the eastern monarch that migrates up from Mexico in the spring, reaching us in early summer, laying its eggs on milkweeds, and then returning to Mexico. There's also a western population that's at great risk of extinction. The eastern population, if you go to the next slide, has been in significant decline from a population high back in the 90s. It's declined an estimated 85% based on the area occupied by colonies in overwintering in Mexico. So this is a species that we really emphasize in gardening. If you can plant monarch host plants, and there's several milkweeds that are native to Massachusetts that will support monarchs. This is one of the ones that we really emphasize, just to provide that resource for monarchs as they're coming through their migratory paths, making sure they have good breeding habitat that's protected from pesticides, and that those caterpillars are given the best chance that they can in our yards and garden. All right, so I'm going to go through some of the threats. I've already talked through some of them, but habitat loss, pesticides, diseases and pathogens, and climate change are really the big buckets of threats that we're trying to address through planting pollinator habitat and protecting it from pesticides. Continue on. There is really an unprecedented scale of habitat loss across the country. Since 2008, about 53 million acres of grassland have been converted to crops in the Great Plains. So that is just a massive scale of conversion. A lot of that's through sort of expansion of field sizes and removal of tree lines and hedgerows. All of that reduces insect habitat in that landscape. Next slide. But the same is true for urban landscapes. So lawns are also monocultures. Habitat loss isn't just occurring in agricultural spaces. There's over 40 million acres of lawn, which by some estimates makes it the largest sort of cultivated crop in the US. Turfgrass would be the largest irrigated crop in the US. And these lawns and ornamental landscapes support, in general, based on existing research in this space, they support fewer pollinators, beneficial insects, and songbirds than landscapes that are largely dominated by native plants, especially native flowering plants. Next slide. So both in urban and ag spaces, pesticides pose a variety of threats to pollinators. And pesticides is kind of an umbrella term that includes insecticides or things that kill insects, as well as fungicides and herbicides. Next slide. In our urban spaces, these are often used for cosmetic reasons. They can wash off from grass and patios and impervious surfaces into waterways and affect our aquatic invertebrates and other wildlife. And one thing that it's important to note is that more pesticides are used per acre in urban spaces than in many agricultural areas. So it's not something that just happens out in farm fields. It's something that's happening around our communities as well. Next slide. One of the more challenging types of insecticides or groups of insecticides are the highly toxic systemic insecticides, including the neonicotinoids, which is something you'll probably hear a lot about in the news. So these are chemicals that are highly toxic to bees and other beneficial insects and are widely used across many landscapes. They are systemic, meaning they're water soluble. They'll move into and be taken up by plants and into pollen and nectar, where they can be taken back to nests by bees and other beneficial insects that feed on nectar and pollen. They're also highly persistent, so the residues can last a long time. So this is common. These are, the photo is from a bumblebee kill that occurred when a linden tree that was in bloom was treated with a neonicotinoid for, I believe, aphids. And so bumblebees that came and fed on that pollen the nectar of this linden tree were exposed to lethal doses of this neonicotinoid. And it was really a terrible event. And I think it was something on the order of like 25,000 bumblebees were killed in this parking lot with these linden trees. These are commonly used in other urban spaces too, for grub control in lawns, where they can then move into plants that are nearby lawns. So something to look out for as you're thinking about how to landscape or what products your landscaping company might be using. Please ask about systemic insecticides and what might be used, just to know how we could maybe reduce the risk further for these pollinators. Next slide. One of the other threats that I mentioned is diseases. So moving bees means potentially moving diseases. And there's one of the big triggers for the rusty patch bumblebee decline was probably spillover of pathogens from managed bees into the wild bee population. So this is just something to be aware of. Next slide. And we recommend not purchasing other managed bees or commercially produced butterflies, because shipping insects can really spread those diseases, pathogens, and non-native species and genotypes to new areas, threatening wild populations. All right, last slide on threats. So the final threat here, the big bucket, is climate change, which is probably going to have pretty unpredictable impacts up here in New England and on Nantucket. Some of the ones we're concerned about are mismatches in plant and insect phenology. So where a plant is blooming, but a pollinator hasn't emerged yet, or vice versa, or erratic weather patterns that cause problems with flower availability. So something like, I know it's 70 degrees in Vermont today. We're probably going to have an early season warm up where things start to come out and bloom. And then maybe we'll get a hard freeze where some of those blooms fall off and there's less floral resource availability later in the spring, causing, a starvation period for bees. These are some of the things that I worry about for pollinators going forward, and that might lead to some shifts in ranges and community composition of species of different bees, moving into the future. But if you go to the next slide, all of these things, I hope, are things that we can address by careful planning, including in our own small spaces in our yards and gardens. So for habitat loss, what we're working on is conserving and creating habitat for pollinators. With pesticides, we're really working to reduce reliance on pesticides, reduce cosmetic use of pesticides. For diseases and non-natives, reducing risks from managed pollinator species to our wild bees and other beneficial insects. And then with climate change, planning for species and habitat diversity. And I will talk more about that in terms of planting for pollinators. But really what we're trying to do is build as much resilience into the system as possible by planting a diversity of different kinds of plant species. So for these early season warm-ups, for example, if you have a variety of different kinds of trees and shrubs that bloom in the spring, hopefully if you get an early season warm-up and a hard freeze, you'll have something else that comes out and blooms as soon as possible after that. That's something that can be provided by having really good plant diversity in your yard and garden. Okay, so finally getting into the meat of the presentation. I know I've already taken a lot of time, but this is really what I wanted to focus on, which is what bees need and what you can do to protect pollinators and beneficial insects. So let's talk about planting for pollinators. So the amount of natural habitat in our landscapes has a direct influence on bee diversity and abundance. What we're really doing when we put plants that flower and provide pollen and nectar is building a foundation upon which bees can thrive and other beneficial insects can thrive in our landscapes and build out that base of the food chain for other wildlife. So what habitat provides? There's three big things that we're looking to provide. Food for pollinators, so nectar, pollen, and host plants. Shelter, so nesting sites and overwintering sites. And then refuge or protection from pesticides. So this is where we're sort of layering in all of that information that I talked about biology to really try and provide food, shelter, and refuge for pollinators. Next slide. And one of the things that I'm going to emphasize throughout the rest of this presentation is the importance of diversity. So planting diverse flowering species directly influences and enhances bee abundance and diversity. The more kinds of flowers that you have in your garden, the more kinds of bees that those flowers are going to support. The more likely it is that you're hitting a specialist bee plant, for example. Next slide. If you look around, you might already have some. So you might have an unmanaged area that has flowering plants. You might have flowering trees and shrubs like willows and maples. Maybe you have an old tree that's full of little beetle holes that can provide nesting resources for bees. Maybe behind some of your existing garden plants, you have patches of bare soil that bees can burrow into. So looking around, identifying and conserving what's already there is the first step. The next step is thinking about how you can improve. So what pollinators need is a succession of continuous bloom through spring, summer, and fall. So all pollinators are needing nectar and pollen from flowers to complete their life cycle. So it's important to have, a couple of things, hopefully 3 to 4, maybe more things in bloom at any given time through the season. That's the ideal. So thinking about how you can improve if you already have, a flower garden is looking for those gaps in bloom time. When is there nothing in bloom in your garden? What's blooming in your neighbor's yard? It's getting pollinator activity. Put that in your yard too, so that you're filling in that bloom gap for pollinators in your yard. Thinking about species selection, it's good to think about host plants. That's both for butterflies and also for bees. So bees kind of fall on a spectrum from bees that really need a specialized, they have a specialized relationship with a kind of plant or a family of plants, to those that will kind of forage on anything, like sweat bees. But some of the ones that you might have, the rose mallow bee forages on hibiscus species, for example, or some of the Melissades longhorn bees just are looking for plants that are in the sunflower family. So the more that you can sort of look at and think about how you can incorporate some of those plants that support specialist bees, that will be good for providing for the diversity of bees in your environment. One of the ways you can do that is really just by trying to get as many plant families as possible into your yard. So have some legumes, have some sunflowers, have some of the rose family out there. That will probably help get you to having both generalists and specialist bees in your yard. For butterflies, a lot of butterflies and moths are very specific in where they're going to lay their eggs and what those will develop on. The Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center has plant lists of butterfly host plants, and that is a great resource if you're looking to support butterflies in your yard. Wildflower.org, hopefully that's easy to remember. They also have info on bees and other beneficial insects, but great resource for butterfly host plants. One of the things I also emphasize, if you have the space for it, is putting in early spring trees and shrubs. So some of the ones that might be good selections out on Nantucket include different willows and maples, serviceberry, peach plum, high bush blueberry. All of these are great spring resources for that kind of vulnerable period when queen bumblebees are coming out, when mining bees are starting to come out, and the only thing that's in bloom are your woody species and your spring ephemerals. I would definitely recommend looking at these if you have the space for them. They are super rewarding if you have a willow in your yard. This is a mining bee on willow, and they just get absolutely covered in willow pollen. It's really a rewarding resource for them, and then a rewarding experience for you to go out and look at all these bees visiting your early spring trees and shrubs. One thing to avoid would be some of the cultivated plant varieties that have been bred to be really showy, but might not have a lot in the way of nectar and pollen. So double-petaled ornamental varieties, for example, can look really pretty, but sometimes they're double-petaled. They've sacrificed stamens, or they've sacrificed the pollen-producing part of the plant for more petals and more showiness. So whenever possible, look for locally sourced, native, straight species and pesticide-free plants or seeds. Keep going, sorry. But there are some garden varieties that can look pretty and provide lots of nectar and pollen. So I would definitely suggest, one of the tricks to being a good pollinator gardener is to be a bit of a nosy neighbor and watch the flowers in your yard and your neighbor's yard to see what's really getting a ton of pollinator activity. Can I put that in my yard too? Ask them, what is that? Where can I get it? And always be looking for sort of locally sourced native species. Next slide, please. So in terms of Nantucket plants, plant selection, I know the Land Council is coming out with this great guide on planting for pollinators. And I just wanted to highlight some of the species that are in that guide that can be great for pollinators on Nantucket. So of course, butterfly weed, which is one of the primary milkweeds in Massachusetts. That's a monarch host plant. That's a wonderful plant to have in the yard. It also attracts a ton of beneficial wasps for natural enemies for pest control in your garden. Baptisia, blue false indigo, is a lovely, it starts out small, but it grows into almost more of a shrub over time. Great bumblebee plant. Swamp rose mallow that can support that specialist bee, the rose mallow bee, which is pictured there. Bee balm is a great plant for all different kinds of bees, large to small. And then later in the season, Joe Pye weed and goldenrods, asters. Also, mountain mint is a great mid-season species that's great for both bees, but also your beneficial insects and natural enemies that provide pest control for your garden. So all of these are great species, and definitely check out the guide produced by the Land Council for more species. This is just a selection of some of my favorites from that list. Those plants can go in all kinds of places around your yard and garden. So you can think a little bit outside of the box. My advisor for my master's liked to talk about mullet gardening, which was business in the front, party in the back, where you can have a lot more chaos in your backyard. In my case, I like to put a ton of stuff in my front yard too, but that's probably because I'm a pollinator conservationist. One of the options there is putting flowering species into your lawns. So some of these that do really well under the same kind of management as turf are not native, but provide a lot of interest for pollinators. So white clover would be an example. Bugleweed is an example of species that do well in lawns, managed the same way as your grass, but also providing some resources for pollinators at the same time. Parking strips and berms are also a great way to connect different areas of your neighborhood with pollinator plants. So this is a strip that often, will have grass, but could easily have some of the low-growing pollinator plants. This was in my neighbor's property with milkweeds and roses and all different kinds of things that provided a lot of interest. So I was always the nosy neighbor going by and looking at what was visiting this parking strip. And in addition to planting flowers for pollinators, making sure you have some of those undisturbed areas for nesting. It's easy to kind of mulch everything in your garden, but I would ask that you think about allowing some bare areas for pollinators that live in the ground to be able to access bare ground. And also think about how you can incorporate some bunch grasses, some native bunch grasses like little blue stem or prairie dropseed, things that provide sort of structure and also good nesting habitat for bumblebees. Also some pithy stemmed plants that for the bees that nest in above ground in little tunnels. Some of the species that are in the list already of pollinator plants are pithy stemmed. So like bee balm would be an example. Raspberries are an example of plants that have those pithy stems. So if you're planting pollinator plants, oftentimes you're already covering your bases around having some above ground nesting habitat. And then if possible, if you can leave brush piles or snags where they're present, that can also provide some areas for overwintering habitat and nesting. And then finally, one of the things we really emphasize is that pollinators need to be protected from the impacts of pesticides, especially insecticides. So being really careful about where you're gardening for pollinators and how that's being managed, making sure that you're really providing a refuge for these insects, when knowing that the surrounding landscape may have some pesticide exposure possibilities for them. Keep going. Yeah, so urban gardens can really serve as a refuge for bees. And one thing that we are starting to talk more about is checking with your nursery to make sure that plants haven't been treated with systemic insecticides, those water-soluble insecticides that get taken up by plants. They're really common in nursery management and in production of transplants because they protect the plant against whiteflies, aphids, other sucking insects. So it's important to know if that's something that you're going to be putting out into your garden, that it hasn't been treated with something that's going to potentially expose pollinators to pesticides in the gardens. And then once it's in the ground, don't apply pesticides on or near flowering plants. We just released new guidance on this. So if you're interested in knowing more about nursery production and how to find and buy bee-safe plants, I'm sorry that the one on the right is a little bit blurry, but we just released these in the last month. They provide more info on nursery pest management and how to talk to your nursery, give you some of the tools that you might need for asking about their practices, and ensuring that you're buying plants and putting plants in your yard that are going to be safe for pollinators. All right, so the last part of this presentation is just about sort of community engagement and how you can both work on community science efforts for pollinators, contribute to some of our research and conservation work, and then also spread the word about planting for pollinators and how you and your neighbors can support pollinators in your communities. So the first thing that I wanted to mention here is Bumblebee Watch. So I know I talked about the rusty-patched bumblebee and the yellow-banded bumblebee, which we're interested to know if there's any remaining populations of in Massachusetts. But we're also just generally interested in knowing where different species of bumblebees are doing really well and where they might not be doing quite as well. So this is a community science effort. Bumblebee Watch is basically a collaboration between Xerces and some research hubs, other partner organizations that allows us to gather and identify photos of bumblebees that are submitted by hundreds of volunteers across the country. So a smartphone is a really valuable tool for conservation these days. All you need is a camera or some ability to get that photo onto the internet. So taking pictures of different bees, looking in your garden, looking in parks, snapping photos, and then uploading them to the app or to the website. So this has led to some discoveries of rare species needing protection. So there's actually been some rusty-patched bumblebees spotted in Minnesota through Bumblebee Watch. And then Also, species have been documented hundreds of miles outside of their previously known range. So this is a really great project. We would love to have more people involved, especially on Nantucket, especially on Cape Cod, documenting bees and helping us understand both rare and common species and some of their ranges and what maybe even they're foraging on. So I think this number might actually be outdated now. I think we have definitely more than 25,000 records that have been submitted through Bumblebee Watch. And this includes endangered and invasive bumblebee species. Keep going. Another way that you can connect with us and connect with others in your community is by encouraging folks to sign the Pollinator Pledge. So over 2,000 people have already taken this pledge. It's basically a simple set of commitments to grow a variety of pollinator flowers blooming from the spring through the fall, protecting and providing nest sites for bees and host plants for caterpillars, avoiding pesticide use, especially insecticides, and then talking to your neighbors about the importance of pollinators, protecting pollinator habitat. And we actually have a new pollinator habitat sign coming out this year. It's available in both English and Spanish. And I actually think this was a nice sign, but it's even more beautiful now with more colors. So there's more resources about this pledge on the Xerces website. Next slide, including a map of where everyone has taken this pollinator pledge. So it's nice to feel connected to all of these other people interested in pollinator conservation. Oh, yeah, that's great. The next one that I wanted to talk about is just a simple case study. Some of you may have heard of this, the Connecticut Pollinator Pathway, which is now more of a Northeastern Pollinator Pathways project. Started out as a very small group of people in Western Connecticut with big impacts. So it started in Wilton and Ridgefield, Connecticut, looking at how we could connect sort of land trust properties and other existing green spaces with habitats in people's backyards for pollinators. And from there, this is another slide that is out of date on numbers. I think there are easily more than 50 towns that have signed up to be part of this pollinator pathway, both in New York and Connecticut. And so towns have basically joined together to say, we're going to connect larger habitat patches that already exist and encourage people along these connected corridors to put habitat into their yards for pollinators. So connecting the Long Island Sound all the way up into Massachusetts. So a really impressive project with some big impacts. It started very small with a very dedicated group of volunteers. One thing to say about habitat in your yards is that sometimes they can look a little bit messy when they get started, and people have questions about why doesn't this look quite as neat as I'm expecting from this landscape. So you can let your neighbors know about your plantings, let them know why you're planting these plants, let them know what plants you're putting in so that they might be interested in putting them in their yards as well. Signage can definitely be helpful during that kind of messy stage for just advertising and giving a little information about why your yard looks the way it does. All right, and then the last thing that I wanted to mention here is an initiative that we run through the Xerces Society, which is Bee City USA and Bee Campus USA. This is one of our big community engagement projects, which is to basically get communities to sustain pollinators by putting in habitat and protecting it for pesticides through both committing to habitat, sort of incrementally increasing habitat on municipal properties, and also having an IPM plan, an integrated pest management plan in place to reduce reliance on pesticides. So if you're interested in that and learning more about Bee City and Bee Campus, which are sort of certified ways that you can become a Bee City or a Bee Campus, you can look on our website. Next slide. Yeah, we have tons of downloadable resources on the Xerces website, xerces.org. Pretty much everything you could look for, hopefully we'll be able to find in our publication library. We also have a lot of books available, which you can order. And if you're ever interested in, a publication and you can't seem to find it on our website, please reach out to us. We want to know how we can provide the information that you're looking for pollinator conservation and conservation of other invertebrates. And with that, I just want to give a thanks to the Nantucket Land Council for having me, and a great thanks to our membership. We're a member-supported organization, and the many scientists, conservationists, farmers, foundations that make our work possible. So thanks very much for having me, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was terrific. You taught, I think, everyone a lot more about pollinators than most of us know and what to look for. I would definitely agree that the Xerces Society is really a great organization. They do so much good work, not just focused on pollinators, but in general invertebrate conservation. They have an ample amount of resources on their website. The Land Council has created a Planting for Pollinators page on our own website, and we have a bunch of resources listed there that we'll continue to add to. And one of those is a link to the Xerces Society, to your pollinator protection pledge, and some of the other materials that you had mentioned as well. I think we have a link there to Bumblebee Watch and a few of the other programs that you spoke about. We're going to open it up to questions now. Folks who are watching or participating in the Zoom platform can enter questions in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen, and I can go through those and read them to Emily. And while we're waiting for some of those to come in, pollinators, as you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, do go beyond bees, and there are a lot of other important organisms that function as pollinators and are important in a variety of habitats. Here on Nantucket, we do have an abundance of grasslands and heathland areas that certainly tend to be a hot spot, I think, for bees and other invertebrate pollinators. I know that a couple of our conservation partners on the island, the Nantucket Conservation Foundation and the Linda Nature Foundation, have been participating in regional surveys of native bee species and their populations. And I think according to them, some of the preliminary data points to really high native bee diversity on Nantucket compared to some of the other communities that are taking part in that research. So we'll link to that from our website as well at some point. But yeah, I think that we still have a great resource of pollinators out here. And so creating some good habitat for them in our landscapes is what we're really hoping to do, and create more of a network across the island to support these critters. So I know I have a few questions in here. One question is actually a suggestion. Do you have a suggestion for keeping the carpenter bees out of the shed without harming them? I know I've certainly seen some in the eaves of my house as well. And I think people often get concerned that they are doing damage. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that can be a little bit of a tricky one. If you have one of the suggestions has been, and I don't know how successful it is, has been to have, another sort of untreated wood resource available. So some untreated wood that is somewhere else nearby that hopefully carpenter bees might burrow into instead of burrowing into your shed. I think with a lot of those kinds of species that provide that are kind of a nuisance species, especially when they're becoming a structural issue, that's when it really comes down to how much can you really live with this bee in your shed, or a wasp under your eaves, wasp nest under your eaves. How much are they interfering with or causing sort of a health and safety concern for you? One thing I will say about carpenter bees, I also had them in my shed, is that they look and sound a lot scarier than they are. And a lot of times they're reusing the same holes from year to year. So I wasn't finding that they were becoming more of a structural issue over time. And actually a lot of the interaction that I was having with them was with the territorial males. So it's more of a getting used to getting startled by a carpenter bee that you're interacting with, knowing that it can't harm you. It's a male bee, that the female bees are really just trying to go about their day. And the ones that you're sort of seeing as you may be going to and from your shed might be the males just buzzing around, waiting for that female to come back. So some of it is just a learning to live with insects around you. And some of it is trying out different strategies, like maybe having an alternative untreated wood source nearby. I wish I had a better answer for you than that, but I was never able to bring myself to do any management of carpenter bees in my shed.
Great. Well, I think that's helpful input and perspective anyway. Another question that's come in from someone who lives in close proximity to the beach here, which is obviously a significant part of the island as well. And we do have very sandy soils. And they're asking a little bit about the plants and creating a garden habitat and habitat for pollinators in really sandy soils. And I can say that a lot of the species that we're recommending are specifically adapted to our soils out here and won't require much amendment or addition in order to survive. But I'd love any extra thoughts that you have, Emily, about working with sandy soils and also how that might impact the nesting of bees.
Yeah, I will say that it's all about picking the species that are already adapted to that kind of a habitat. Like seaside goldenrod is an example of a species that loves sandy soil and can thrive in it, even when you think it might not be able to. There's also bees that are very well adapted to living in sandy soils. So some bees actually really prefer sandy soils. So you'll see, I mean, this is one of those things where I hope that one of the things that you take away from this presentation is just that it's really valuable to be observant of your local environment. So seeing what grows well in your neighbor's yard that has the same soil, seeing what comes out of the soil, looking for those nesting holes, looking for those nesting spaces that you can protect in your yard. I will reassure you that there are plenty of plant species that will do well in those sandy soils. You just have to pick the right ones, and that there are bees that will nest in those soils too, and that they will find them if they're there and if there's flowers around for them to forage on.
Great, thanks for that. Another one here that's a good specific question for you. I've heard that after 2 50-degree days, it's okay to cut back the stems that might host solitary bees over the winter. Is that right? When do they leave the stems and when can we cut them back safely? And this goes into another question that had popped up generally about garden maintenance. So the end of the season, and how I know out here, we often will see people really just want to clean up the garden at the end of the season, but maybe you can answer this question and talk a little bit about general maintenance.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is, I wish that I had put a slide in about this, because it is a question that I often get about how do you manage these stems for stem nesting bees. So what I recommend is leaving flower stalks intact over the winter. So that's things, your cone flowers, for example, your echinacea that has these beautiful seed heads. Birds will come in and eat seeds over the winter. So they're providing cover, they're providing this nesting and overwintering habitat. And then in the early spring, like you said, when temperatures sort of regularly get into the 50s, that's when you can prune them back to create new nest sites. So I would recommend, cutting at a variety of different heights, anywhere from, 8 inches to 2 feet. Cut them back, and that will allow space for newbies to come in and make their nests that coming summer. So that's generally my recommendation. Leave things over the winter, cut them back when temperatures kind of get into the 50s and 60s in spring. And so bees will come out of the old vegetation and go into those new nest sites the next summer.
Great. That sounds good. And I think it's just an important thing to keep in mind, because we get into our habits of how we maintain things without thinking about what else might be using them. Another question. Oh, here's a good one. Can you talk about deer? if we choose the plants you suggested, will I need to put up a fence to keep the deer out? And that is a great question. I know that in our pollinator guide, we're trying to indicate the plants that are most likely to be less appetizing to the deer. I know on island, it seems to depend a little bit on where you are and how much else the deer have to nibble on. We have, Emily, just so you know, an overabundance of deer out here, and it is very difficult to have a successful garden without putting a fence up to keep them out. So we have really focused on trying to recommend species that are not as appetizing to deer, but that's a tricky one. I'd love your thoughts on it as well.
That is a really tricky one, and I don't have a great answer. There's, some plants are slightly less attractive to deer, but it does kind of come down to, did you happen to have deer wander through your yard and start nibbling? Because at some point, a lot of different things are attractive to deer. I'd say it's more important for you to, put up sort of animal guards or browse protection if you're planting trees and shrubs. A lot of the trees and shrubs that are pollinator attractive are attractive as deer browse as well. So looking into, little animal guards to keep deer from browsing them while they're still vulnerable. Hopefully, I think it's kind of a case by case basis on if you're seeing, year to year deer come through and browse all your plants to the ground, you're probably going to want to put up some fencing. But otherwise, a lot of the species that are on the list, hopefully will be slightly less attractive to deer.
And what are your thoughts about some of the natural deer sprays while plants are getting a little bit more established?
So you mean like the coyote pea, that kind of thing? That as long as you're not, so those can also be somewhat repellent to pollinators. So I wouldn't put them on right as things are flowering, but earlier in the season, they are probably fine to go on. I haven't applied those to things that are flowering for fear of knocking off my pollinators or scaring them away as well.
Mm-hmm. Good call. Good idea. Okay, so here's another question. What are the best, thank you for a great presentation. What are the best pollinator plants for wetlands? Rose mallow, what else for wet areas?
Joe Pye is another great wet plant that was on your list. There's actually a couple of different resources that you could draw from in addition that I can send Emily to you after this. If you are able to send out to the Zoom participants an email, I can attach some additional resources that would be useful specifically for wetland plants. Probably
sure thing. And I think that there certainly are some parts of the island where the soil's not quite as sandy and retains a little bit more water. I think most people won't be planting directly in wetlands. That's something that actually requires a Conservation Commission permit out here. But if you have damper or wetter soils, then again, I think that a lot of the species that we selected on the list in our guide will actually do fine in some damper soils as well with more organic material. Swamp milkweed also, I think. And
swamp milkweed, boneset. I don't know if swamp rose for a shrub is also a nice one.
Yes, absolutely. So there are some there to choose from. Absolutely. Okay, so here's another question. Hi, both Emilys. I'm a landscaper here on Nantucket. I strongly support no pesticides on my properties. Any ideas on how to present to my customers the idea of a pollinator area in their yards? Well, that's a great question. And I can say on behalf of the Land Council that we would certainly be happy to provide you with a link to our pollinator planting guide and some additional information to Xerces Society as well, and be happy to talk to you more directly about that. But Emily, what's your experience been?
Well, I think I'm probably in the boat of having most people come to me already wanting to put pollinator habitat into their yards. But I will say that there is a ton of consumer demand for pollinator habitat. I think there was a recent study that over 1 in 4 Americans had bought pollinator plants for their yard in the last couple of years. So hopefully you won't find too much resistance to the idea of putting a pollinator area into a yard or garden. It's really kind of a win-win in terms of aesthetics. It's a beautiful space. It's also a space for a lot of learning and kind of, if you have kids around, it's a hands-on kind of activity for them to go out and look at what's visiting these flowers. So one way to really get up close and personal with the natural world. So I think there's a lot of different ways you can kind of sell pollinator habitat, but hopefully some combination of beauty and pollinator conservation and interest in insects might get you there.
Yeah, and those are great points. And also I think that another important thing to remember is you really don't need much space at all. We're sort of suggesting an area of even 20 or 25 square feet is plenty to install some plants and create a little mini pollinator habitat. And certainly would encourage people who have pre-existing garden beds to repurpose one of your existing beds, or better yet, if you have an area of lawn that doesn't need to be lawn, turn it into a little pollinator garden. So I think that to suggest maybe to clients that you've seen or heard a lot about establishing pollinator gardens and just asking if that's something they might be interested in learning more about would be a great way to approach it.
Yeah, actually, I have one more thought there, which is maybe not applicable to you as a landscaper, but for me, I'm a lazy yard management person. So I really like low input things. The pollinator garden that I put in my front yard, I replaced a bunch of lawn. It took a lot of upfront effort, but then as it developed, it was really rewarding to just see this thing mature and grow into this beautiful pollinator garden with very little work on my part. So in terms of long-term maintenance, putting in the right plants for the right place meant that I had to put in very little in terms of water inputs after those plants got going in my yard. It required very little work except for some mulching at the beginning of every season. So yeah, it's great for lazy gardeners like myself.
Yeah, I think as you talked about in your presentation, in order to get the most benefit from the garden for the pollinators, the whole point is to install it and then leave it alone and do as little as possible to it so that that habitat is there. Then there was another question if some of the species on the list are perennials, and yes, some of them will reseed themselves. And the guide that we have created that will be available to folks who register on our website has options for a small, medium, and a large garden. So there's some different species depending on how much space you're planning to use. And one of the other things that we certainly will recommend, if not in your first year, maybe in the subsequent year, is to also consider some of the small shrubs or medium-sized shrubs that Emily spoke about as well. Blueberries certainly are great out here, and a number of others that provide great flowers and pollinator habitat as well. I've seen you had a slide in your presentation that talked a little bit about lawn and having some flowering plants in your lawn. And I certainly have seen over the last few years a little bit more of a no-mow movement, especially earlier in the season, to allow for some of those additional plants, even in a lawn setting, to bloom so that there's more pollen and flowers available for bees and other insects. Is that something that you have seen a lot of and that Xerces Society has supported as far as letting things go a little bit longer before starting any regular maintenance?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that in my own yard, I went to kind of a 3-week mowing schedule, or just kind of looking at it and seeing, okay, my white clover has kind of reached an end here. I can come in and do a mow. But some of those early season things like that you might not love to see as if you love a perfect lawn, but like dandelions and violets and clovers actually provide great either pollen or nectar resources early on in the season. And they really I don't think they take away too much from just having the open space of the lawn, if that's something that you like having around. So there was a study from Springfield, Mass. I think there was a grad student in the last couple of years that did a study on just reducing the number of times that you mowed through the season. And they found you get more flowering plants coming into yards and you get more bees visiting those yards. If you just go back from, once a week to once every 2 weeks or once every 3 weeks, the more time you can kind of build in between mows, the more likely you're going to be having things come up and flower in between that provide some resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know this is not a turf management presentation, but certainly the way that you manage your lawn is going to affect how those grasses or the species in the lawn grow above ground and below ground. And one of the things that we're really emphasizing in our Planting for Pollinators guide is the fact that the pollinators essentially are kind of like the pandas of the habitat. And when you're creating one of these pollinator gardens or habitats, you're really just increasing the overall biodiversity of this area of space. And that's above ground and below ground. The additional roots and the fungi that are down there really help to support healthy soil, build your soil so that it is more self-sustaining and will continue to require very little input and maintenance on an ongoing basis. So let's see, there's actually a question here for any suggestions for managing grubs in the lawn besides insecticides. Does Nantucket ban insecticides? Nantucket does not ban insecticides. There definitely have been some discussions about potential prohibitions on certain kinds of herbicides. But there is no, Massachusetts is a pretty tough state as far as instituting that type of a ban. I know that there are definitely some natural products. I don't know, Emily, if you have any experience with that directly.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different kinds of grubs that you can have in your yard. And a lot of the things that are used for grub control are those systemic insecticides that end up in your plants nearby. So there's some newer things like diamide insecticides that are toxic to particularly actually butterflies. And then there's also your neonicotinoid systemic insecticides. Both of those are commonly used in turf management for grubs. And I would not recommend their use if you're wanting to create a space that is healthy for pollinators. In terms of grub management, it can be a little bit of a challenge. European chafer is one of the big ones that's kind of come in and seems to be spreading and be a pest in lawns and turf. And it feeds on grass roots while it's in that grub phase. So it's killing the grass, it's leaving these visible dead patches. But it all comes down to kind of how many per square feet are you getting? And lawns can often tolerate a certain amount before they start to really have these big dead patches. One of the things that has been helpful for learning how to manage those without chemicals is learning that irrigation actually is one of the things that is sort of repellent to the adult females when she's looking to lay her eggs in grass. She doesn't like really dense grass plantings, and she doesn't like really well irrigated grass plantings either. So the three main recommendations that I've seen for European chafer is mowing high to encourage dense grass stands, and then also to irrigate well and make sure your grass has adequate nutrients. So sort of a healthier grass stand actually leads to less egg laying and fewer grubs the following year. And then I could talk more about sort of integrated pest management for turf grass, but I think that's a whole different presentation.
Yes, absolutely. An important one for sure. And then here's another good one. What about the importance of color? Do you suggest a mixture of color, or is a lot of similar color okay for pollinators in the landscape?
So I think there was, when we started to build out sort of publications initially around pollinator conservation, there was a lot of emphasis on color. And I think what it's actually trying to get you to is a lot of plant families. So that's sort of where I am now, is if you have a lot of plant families, a lot of times you're also getting diversity of color on top of that. But sort of from the ecological perspective or the wanting to support lots of diverse bees, starting with, putting in legumes, putting in roses, putting in sunflowers, getting a diversity of different kinds of plants and types of flowers. That's what I'd sort of look for first. And a lot of times that will also get you to a diversity of color.
Great. Okay, well, I think with that, Emily, we can probably wrap it up. I think we've gone through most of our questions here. So I just want to really thank you again for taking the time and being with us, and to the Xerces Society for all of their work. Again, we will definitely have links to the Xerces Society and some of these resources that Emily spoke about on our webpage and our website. And again, I would just encourage everyone, if you're interested in creating some pollinator habitat in your yard, or you think you know someone who may, even if they only have a small area to do so, then check out our website, register for our program, and you'll receive a copy of our new pollinator guide, as well as additional resources. You'll get signed up for some monthly emails throughout the season that will give you some additional tips and information to help you along the way also. So thank you again, Emily, and thanks everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you soon. Happy spring.